brothers, do you recall when the grasslands reached to the horizon? And the deafening roar of countless wings overhead. Back when Rome was a village and Britain the Emerald Island. Before we gave up on our future and buried our dead.
Okay, we are on episode 46, I believe, right? So we're going to continue with the Nartic mythological and epic tales. And just as a reminder, those who weren't with us last time, it's an epic story cycle that encompasses pretty much most of the peoples of the Caucasus, most of the different groups, regardless of their ethnic origin or their linguistic group or their current religious tradition. All the people of Caucasus, or at least a lot of people of the Caucasus, have the Nartic tale cycle. And this is a cycle of stories about heroes that is very unique, and it is believed that it may have contributed to a lot of our other epic and mythological stories, such as Greek, Roman, Germanic, Slavic tales, and everything like. So before we start actually talking, last time we talked in detail about some of the Nartic tales, but right now, before we start, I want to show you guys a video. So you have a better idea of the peoples we're talking about here. And this is just a video of a wedding. Now what we have here is, of course, invited actors, right, who are dancing at the wedding. But then the bride, the groom, and the guests start jumping in. And this is a very good illustration of the Caucasian culture, where everybody knows how to dance. So these are the people I want you to keep in mind as we speak about the Narts and the Nartic epic stories. These are the images I want you to have in your head of these people who know how to celebrate, who know how to feast, who know how to love, who have a lot of life to them, who have a lot of energy to them, who have a lot of passion to them, who, if they're friends, they're real friends. If they're enemies to the end. If they love a woman, they give everything to her. If they go to war, they fight unto death. They're not afraid of dying. They're not afraid of challenges. They are not afraid of hardships. They are people who know what hospitality is about. And these are the images I want you to keep in your mind, because these epic heroes that we're going to be talking about here are the peoples, basically are the images, are the heroes that these people's culture very much kind of came from and that they base themselves on. And that's just common, folks. That, I mean, you can look up Georgian dancing, Ossetian dancing, Azerbaijani dancing, I don't know, Chechen dancing, Dagestani dance, I mean the wedding, and the same kind of Armenian.
Yeah, I just want to comment on how festive these people are. They're, Julie's made reference to them not, they may go hungry after the feast, but at the feast, everyone's going to eat and drink and be merry. And all of these people's, their weddings are huge, their festivals, their holidays. They're just a very lively people. And I suspect all cultures were much more like that before we got this generic corporate thing going on.
It's like their emotions are set to high: sad, mad, happy, fighting, peaceful, whatever. It's on high.
There's an Abkhazia wedding. There's a lot of warrior elements in that dancing. There's a lot of, if you notice the way the men move, a lot of these are moves with a sword, most moves with a saber, with a dagger. There were dances to where women are more, of course, as in a lot of ethnic dances, women are much more flowing. They're much more graceful. They typically move in a way that is very fluent, that kind of thing. So again, as I was saying, as we continue with this, was the talking about the Nartian epic stories, I just wanted you to have these images in mind of these very vibrant, very lively, very passionate peoples. So back to our epic stories. Last time we talked a little bit about the beginning of the epic stories. Now I'm using as the basis for this conversation, I'm mostly using the Ossetian epic cycle, but these epic stories, they are all across Caucasus. Adygay people have these stories. People from Abkhazia have these stories. Dagestani people have some echoes of these stories and their tales, fairy tales mostly. Chechen people have a different version of these tales as well, and epic stories, even though their epic cycle is slightly different. Also, there's some people who currently live in the Georgian region and are speaking a language that is more closely related to the Georgian language group, language group that also have these tales. So it seems that these tales were spread all across the territory of the ancient Caucasus. But the amazing part about these tales, as I said last time, is that each peoples have kind of adapted them to fit their own realities, their own worldview, their own perception of things. So we talked about the very first characters last time. We talked a little bit about Aksar and Aksartar, Aksartag. Those were the twin brothers that began the whole group. Then, of course, we have the story about Uruzmag and Satana, and Satana is the Satana. She is the mother-all. She is the female character that is most relevant to this story. She is the perfect woman, and Uruzmag is her husband. He is the perfect husband. He's her perfect man. And I'm just going to show you a couple of images of those two. Well, actually, I just have one image of Satana, but nonetheless, she's always associated with feasting. She's associated with wisdom. She's associated with acculturating a lot of things, such as, for example, various crops. I mean, this is an image of the feast, and of course, her table is always the best table. She brews the best beer. She's the one who came up with the idea how to brew beer. She's the one. She actually married her brother, or half brother rather. And as we remember, Satana has a miraculous birth because her mother was actually dead at the time she was conceived. We talked about it last time, a little bit about how that happened. Yeah, so she is the mother-all. She's the only one of the Narts that never dies. She's present in all the Nartic stories, and she exists in every version of the story, whether it's Abkhazian, it's Adyghean, it's the next important characters in the story are going to be I call them children of Satana, but they are not really her children, because the interesting thing about Uruzmag and Satana is that they are ultimately and entirely childless. The reason why they're ultimately and entirely childless is because my impression is that Satana is supposed to be mother-all. So all the kids she has, she never gives birth to anyone, seemingly. I mean, no, let me back up on that. There are some tales in which it is talked about the fact that they were cursed with childish, not having children. We're going to put it very simply. And because Uruzmag at one point in time, having gotten rid of his first wife, or rather Satana got rid of his first wife, he was cursed with only having children that would die on him. And there's actually one of the side tales where he does have a child and a son, and the son is given away to be fostered in a different home. And when the child grows up, and Uruzmag, I'm going to pull up a picture of Uruzmag visits that family. He does not know that the boy is his son, and so he kills his son. But Uruzmag overall is just not very blessed with kids, and that's just his life. But yeah, so Satana, of course, is responsible. Okay, so there's the images of Uruzmag. Uruzmag is also usually the wise senior figure in these stories. There's Uruzmag, Soslan, and Hamidz. Hamidz is one of the members of the entire lineage of Arsartag's lineage. Yeah. Is probably the most prominent one. They are the warriors. They are the ones who forefront and center. But Soslan is the next character we're going to talk about. He's probably the most beloved character. He is a character that is also he's kind of a son of Satana, but not directly. If we remember, she was coveted, desired by water spirit. This water spirit did not succeed in impregnating her, but he wound up basically fertilizing the water she was washing herself in, and yeah, that resulted in a child being brought into life from a stone. And as we remember early on, this child, of course, there's the motif of iron. There's the motif of getting iron ore from within what appears to be a boulder, and he is hardened. Satana actually calls upon the smith god to temper her son. And when the smith god, the god of iron, the god who of making these amazing items like swords and daggers, is working on creating a container in which he's going to put Soslan in order to temper him. Trickster character walks by and distracts the god, and as a result, the container winds up being a little bit too short. And so Soslan is tempered entirely except for his knees. So he's completely and utterly, he's like iron. He's compared to iron, and he's impervious to absolutely any sort of damage except for one thing, that's his knees that are, yeah. And that, of course, echoes to the Achilles tale. I mean, this idea of a very basically bulletproof character who is a hero that cannot be harmed by anyone, is therefore greatest warrior ever, but he has that one weak spot. Now with Achilles, it is his heel, while Achilles, we just know that he was dipped into the river Styx and he's impervious to any kind of damage. We don't know why. Here, to me, this tale seems to be a little bit more archaic because they explain it very simple. He was born from inside basically an ore boulder, a boulder that contained ore, and he was forged, and he is made of iron. In a later character that is going to be a later hero in these epic cycles, we're going to see how that later evolves from iron to steel. But Soslan is a very great character. He is a warrior, of course, but he's also the Narts. They're not very different from you and I. The Narts have good sides and bad sides. Sometimes they do very bad things. So Soslan, unlike his father Uruzmag, though even as we remember last time, even Uruzmag is not perfect because he is known to have tricked people. He is known to have tried to divorce his wife, which did not work out for him very well. Because you do not try to divorce the mother of Satana. She's more clever than you, and if you try to outsmart her, woe is upon you. But Soslan is a little bit more questionable character, though he is an epic character. He overcomes a lot of hardships, but he's also very much beloved because of his human nature, because of his human flaws, because of the way that he behaves. He's very much akin to the people that these people would see and know in their world. One of the most important stories about Soslan, there's many stories about Soslan. He overcomes a lot of giants. We talked last time about the giants. He travels to the underworld. He travels to the underworld to acquire one of his brides. I mean, after he has one wife, and after that wife passes away, he goes to acquire a different wife from the underworld, and that's again very reminiscent of the Greek mythologies. But his travel to the underworld, the land of them, it's not quite the land of the dead, and it's not quite the underworld in the sense, in the Greek sense. It's more like the other side of reality. He sees some interesting things in there. In one way, it is very reminiscent of Dante's Divine Comedy, because as he's traveling through these lands, he sees things that he doesn't understand, and he has to come to a witch who has to explain to him what these weird and strange things that he saw meant. For example, he sees a woman who has precious fabrics, silks, and other precious fabrics coming out of her nose nonstop. And she's suffering horribly, and he does not understand what this can possibly mean. So later on, when he comes out from the underworld, he asks the witch, he asks the wise woman, what is it that he just saw? And he's explained, well, this woman, she was a seamstress, she was entrusted to cut the fabric for other women. And when she did so, she would chop off little pieces of the fabric to keep for herself. And now this is her punishment in the afterlife. There's another woman who has 2 lizards chewing on her breasts, and she's suffering horribly. And so again, he asks the wise witch, the wise woman, what is it that this meant? And he finds out that this woman was supposed to be a milk mother, a foster mother. She was supposed to help feed other women's babies, and she would claim that she would, yes, I'm going to feed your baby. She would put them to her breast and cover them with her shawl, with her throw, and not actually feed the baby. And for that, she was suffering horribly, and that's why the lizards are now gnawing at her breasts. He sees other things. I mean, there's a woman, for example, who never it seems, it's interesting, most of the female suffering seems to be somehow associated with their breasts for some reason. There's another woman who basically, those stones that they used to have when they would grind the stones. So there's a woman who has a grinding process going on her chest. And he's asked, why is that? And that's because she never shared any flour with anybody else. She never helped out other people. And so for her, basically not very nice neighborly behavior. That's what she's being punished for. And another woman has a very similar thing happening, but all the flour that comes out is black and rotten. And it's because she gave poor flour to her neighbors. So that kind of indicates to us what kind of things people are punished for in the afterlife, what they suffer for. But other than that, the afterlife looks a lot like, of course, their life. You know, it has the same mountains, it has the same rivers, it has the same forests. It's very similar to the world that the people know. There's another interesting story that I just personally like the story. So he's riding along and he sees this woolen ball of wool laying on the ground, and he thinks, actually, if I bring this back to my mother, to Satana, she'll be able, to my foster mother, or to my adopted mother, she will be able to make nice clothing with this. And so he picks up this ball of wool and he attaches it to his saddle, and as he's riding, it starts beating on the legs of his horse and hurting his horse. And so Soslan, later on, he has to throw it away, and later on he asks the witch, he asks the wise woman, he says, what does this mean? What was this about? And she says, well, it's like some people's friendship. They will smile to your face and they will be nice and they will look very pleasant and say good words to you. But behind your back, they will beat upon your horse to weaken him and make him fall and cause you death. So that's a very, I think, timeless tale, pretty much. That's something that we've all been more or less exposed to if we're over the age of 3, I think. And a couple other interesting aspects about Soslan. And one of the tales, Soslan goes and acquires, he kills his enemies and he makes a cloak out of their scalps. And this is, of course, in the Ossetian version of the epic stories. This does not exist in the other versions of the stories. And the researchers think that this might be hearkening back to the Scythian times, when Scythians, according to Herodotus, Scythian tradition was to make clothing out of the skins of your dead enemies, and particularly scalps. Sometimes was not for children. If you have anybody under the age of 16, remove them from the screen. But to where Scythians, for example, would take the skin of the hands and use that as their gloves. Or they really like to use as napkins the scalps of their dead enemies. I don't know how that's hygienic, but whatever rocks their goat. But yeah, there's even that image in the Soslanic, in the Soslanic cycle. Soslan, according to some researchers, is associated with kind of a very early. He's associated with very early solar deity. And the particular reason why he's believed to be associated with the solar deity is the way that he dies. Soslan is courted by a very beautiful girl, and he turns this very beautiful girl down. And she gets very upset. She goes to her, she winds up, of course, being a goddess, and she winds up going to her father, and she winds up complaining to her father about the fact that this beautiful man, he had hurt her. And so it's a whole entire story. But to make long story short, is what the god does is that he creates kind of what's the word for it? It's a live wheel. It's a wheel that is alive. It's a wheel that has a presence, it has a soul, and it has a will. And this will is supposed to kill Soslan. And he chases after Soslan. And Soslan starts running from this wheel. And he talks to this wheel. And this is really interesting mythology if you think about it, because first of all, of course, it harkens back to the whole idea of the wheel being sacred and the idea of the wheel of the solar disk being the wheel of the chariot. It also, to me, is somewhat reminiscent of some of the Old Testament and even preceding tales, when you have the idea of a wheel, that the angels kind of look like a wheel, because this wheel has eyes, this wheel has an essence, it has a voice, it has a personality, and the will chases him around and eventually catches up with Soslan and cuts his legs off at the knees. Is there?
Well, I do have a question, perhaps. Now,
Okay. Yeah.
an old friend of the family made a special wheel with mirrors on it, which I assume was probably significant in some way, but I'm not really sure what the purpose of it was. It was an 8-pointed wheel, but it had mirrors on it. I've never seen such a thing before.
Well, it seems like a hearkening to the same sort of epic stories. So as Soslan is laying there dying, different animals, of course, come upon him. And these different animals This is a picture of Soslan after he had his legs cut off. And so first the raven comes to him, and Soslan says, Raven, Raven, come and feast on my blood. I'm dying. And the raven says, no, no, I'm not going to feast on your blood. He cries. He says, you're my brother, you're my friend. I can't feast on your blood. I'm not going to touch you. And of course, Soslan basically blesses the raven, because the raven says, I have never gone hungry because you have left so much carrion everywhere you went that I always had plenty to eat and plenty to feast upon. How could I feast upon you now? You my friend, you somebody who was good to me. And so Soslan says, hereby I bless you, basically, so that you will always be able to see carrion from as far away as you, however far away you may be, so you can always find your prey and eat your fill. Then, of course, the wolf comes, and the same thing happens. The wolf will not feast on Soslan, and Soslan blesses the wolf and gives the wolf freedom and grace, and to hunt freely. And the fox comes, and again, the fox will not eat and partake of Soslan. And the only animal that will partake of Soslan's blood, of Soslan's flesh, is the crow, and he damns the crow and basically says that you will be reviled forever. But that's the story of the death of Soslan. There's a couple other interesting things about Soslan, and it's mainly the story of the horse, but I will talk a little bit more about the horse when we talk about all the heroes together. Okay, I'm going to silence, let David jump in.
Yeah, the whole Ossetian layer of this, which is probably one of the later layers, is very much about steppe peoples that get driven off the steppe at various times and run up into the mountains. But much of these stories have much older layers to them. The steppe elements are very identifiable because they're so pronounced in the Ossetians. And the Ossetians, they say they are mostly, their language and stuff is very closely related to the ancient Alans, who I think collapsed during the Mongol invasions 700-800 years ago, pretty recent comparatively. And but I suspect, as Julie was saying earlier, you had Scythians, Syro-Samaritans, just probably lots of mixing, a lot of the warrior and the horse culture and all of that.
Yep, you're good.
Okay, so the next character that I want to talk about, and the next great hero. So the bigger epic cycle stories, these are characters that are more or less uniform to all the Nartic tales, regardless of which peoples they belong to, is Batraz. And Batraz is another son of Satana in a way, but he's not really son of Satana. He's just somebody whom Satana mothers. He's somebody whom Satana advises. He is also born strangely. He's actually born from his father's back, because his father has a falling out with the mother. The mother gets upset, and his mother is a goddess, and she creates basically a bump on her husband's back, and from that bump, eventually their son is born. And that's, of course, is very reminiscent of Athena and being born out of out of Zeus's head, and also very reminiscent of the whole idea of Dionysus being born out of Zeus's hip or his thigh. So this hero is also, because he's magical, he is also ironclad. He is also capable of standing any kind of attack from any sort of weapon. But later on within the epic cycle, and this kind of reflects the switch from the iron to steel, there's a tale about how unsatisfied was his iron strength, because he's just like Soslan, right? He decides that he wants to become steel. And so he goes through very, very complicated ritual to make himself made out of steel and more stronger. But this does an interesting thing to him. He becomes extremely heavy. Now, in Russian epic stories, there's a character named Svetogor, and it is a character who exists between the it's very much parallel to the character of Batraz, because he exists between this reality and the kind of the netherworld. Both of these characters are too heavy for the earth to bear. They are horses. When they step, they leave puddles of lake. Basically, their footprints become lakes. Svetogor, in particularly, when we get to the Slavic epic stories, is a character who cannot walk on soil, on earth at all, because he sinks. He falls through the ground, goes right into the afterlife, right into the netherworld. It's a character that is very, on the one hand, appears to be giant, but on the other hand, is very human-like. Now, in a lot of these, I mean, human-like in size. So in a lot of these epic tales, these characters are, they change their size depending on the story. I mean, the same warrior can be the size of a mountain one moment, and then next moment his wife can put him in her palm of her hand, for example. So this is normal for the epic stories, especially for the mythological stories, for the characters to change their size. But Batraz is known for a couple of interesting things that he has done. But because he was born by such a weird means, the other Narts kind of look at Batraz a little weird. And that's another thing that makes a lot of these epic heroes stand out. So you have the Narts as a whole, and the Narts, they're neither gods nor peoples. They are almost, they're very similar to the Greek heroes, as we talked about before. They're the Steppe, they're the connecting link between the gods and the peoples. And
They're almost sad.
Batraz, in particular, he is very interesting in the sense that he's exiled, he's kind of ostracized by the other Narts. On the one hand, they value and treasure his strength and his might. I mean, him and Soslan, for example, have very not good relationship. Batraz thinks that Soslan is a little bit not honorable, a little bit maybe.
No.
He decides that he does not want to be like the other Narts, and so he performs a lot of his tricks, a lot of his actions on his own. He is very strong, and so he's very strong. So he, I'm sorry guys, I'm having technical difficulty. I probably should have not brought this fellow with me. It's okay, it's okay. Let's not shake the table too much. We have a puppy running around, everybody, just in case you were wondering, and the puppy is making much ruckus and being very puppy-like. But I just thought I'd show him to you anyway. But okay, so back to our story. So Hamid is very proud of his son, and his son, he takes a wife, he acquires his wife. Of course, his wife is the most beautiful woman of all women possible, and he decides that he does not want to be a jealous husband. He is very he says that I have flaws, and my woman is allowed to have flaws too, and I will praise her forever if she's faithful to me, but if she's not faithful to me, I shall not make her feel horrible for it. I shall not prosecute her for it. So this hero, because he has gone through this ritual, the ritual of making himself into steel, and in order to do this, he had to do something very similar to what Hercules did. He had to die. Basically, he had to anger the gods and have heat sent upon him, solar heat sent upon him, to where he wound up dying of thirst. He wound up dying of the heat, and that strengthened his body, and he came back as stronger, more mighty. So he's partially in this world, partially in the other world, if you look at it from kind of study of the epic tales. But there's an interesting story about Batraz that illustrates how the Caucasian people felt about their gods. So one of their spirits, one of their fertility spirits at one point in time, comes to the village where the wife of Batraz lives. And all the women start going to the fertility spirit and saying, fertility spirit, you know, give me children, give me good luck with having children. And they all get blessed. And then finally, Batraz's wife comes to the spirit and she says, Spirit, I would like for you to also give me luck with bearing children. And the spirit tells her, no, you're an unclean woman. You're not a decent woman. I'm not going to bless you. Go away, get lost. So very upset, of course, the beautiful lady sends a bird as a messenger to her husband, who's off at war at this point in time. And she says, Batraz, we have a problem. I've been disrespected. Come home. Batraz rides home. He comes home. He says, wife, what happened? Who has upset you? She says, Batraz, the fertility spirit, came to us. And he blessed all the women in the village, but he didn't bless me. And Batraz says, oh, yeah, he called me a really bad name, says his wife. He says, okay, all right. He gets on his magical horse. Again, we will talk about horses here in a minute, but he gets on his magical horse and he rides to the homestead of this fertility spirit. And he says, fertility spirit, what the heck? Why did you mistreat my wife so. Now, on the way to this fertility spirit's house, he stops in the woods and he cuts some very big, thick sticks made out of oak that are thick and mighty. And he says, fertility spirit, you don't talk to my woman like that. You don't talk to my wife like that. And he starts beating up the fertility spirit. And the fertility spirit, of course, crying and running away. He's saying, oh, forgive me, please forgive me. He runs around and Batraz chasing him, and the fertility spirit runs into the home of one pious couple and says, hide me, good people, protect me, good people. Batraz is beating me up, and the couple says, okay, we will protect you. But then Batraz comes to their doorstep and he says, this spirit has upset me. You better let him out right now or I will tear down your house. And the frightened man and woman, they let the fertility spirit out. And again, the fertility spirit is running and crying and saying, Batraz, forgive me. I didn't mean to say bad things about your wife. He runs into another person's house and he's chased out of that. Bottom line is this hero chases the fertility spirit around and beats him up until the fertility spirit apologizes profusely and never goes into that village again, let alone speaks to his wife. So so the idea of being pious, the idea of revering these spirits was very, like with a lot of Greek heroes, because these characters, they almost have divine themselves. Their relationship with gods is very short. It's very kind of common. I mean, there are instances when gods come down and party with the Narts. There are instances when the Narts obviously marry the gods or get married to the gods. There are times when the Narts challenge the gods. The particular story about Batraz is that at one point in time, he gets so tired of not having anybody equal to him on this earth that he decides to challenge God himself. Now, in the Ossetian tale, there is an idea of God. This is not the Christian God. This is not a Muslim God. This is not our monotheistic God. It's a God in the sense of, it's the great God. And so Batraz winds up challenging the God. And this is eventually what basically, brings to his death, brings to the end of his career, because by challenging God, Batraz makes all the gods angry about him and he fails. And at this point in time, the kind of I don't want to use the word pagan, but I want to call it pre-Christian. The idea of Christian God suddenly enters the canvas of a very archaic epic story, because at some point in time, from being a generic God of God, the God that he's challenging winds up being God. And suddenly there's certain names, there's certain helpers of God that appear in the canvas of the tale that start being the equivalents of Christian saints. Yeah, so for example, Elijah is one of the characters that he winds up going to. Oatzilla is the name for Elijah, and it's a thunder god in the Ossetian stories. But he winds up, our character Batraz winds up losing this fight, and it is, some researchers believe that this is reflective of the clash of the old faith and the new faith, because in the history of Ossetia, the two religions, the old religion and the new Christian religion, coexisted for several centuries. It took quite a while for Christianity to spread and to take over the region. Now, that is a subject that we see again in some of the other versions. For example, in the Muslim peoples of Chechnya, the Narts die when they refuse to acknowledge God. Of course, in their case, that would be Allah. And they wind up dying as a result of their hubris, of their unwillingness to submit to the new religion. So it's really interesting to see a similar tale, actually, while I'm talking about. For example, there's the whole tale about Christ going down into the underworld in the Greek mythos. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, where he actually went into the world into the land of the dead, and he brought out everybody who was there. He brought all the shades out, and he took them to either to heaven and to hell accordingly. Chris, does that tale sound familiar to you? There was an early Greek tale.
Not at all.
Yeah, there was an early Greek tale that when the Greeks were first.
I've heard Greek mythological stories like that, but not Christian ones.
Yeah, there is actually a story about Christ going down into Hades, because in Greeks, when they started converting to Christianity, sorry, a little bit of side tangents. I mean, the reason why the Greeks were so keen on actually converting to Christianity was because to them, their afterlife was pretty colorless. It was pretty bleak. It was not much to look forward to, because in the Greek afterlife, of course, the dead didn't have much of a personality. They were shades. They had no memory. We all know that. They drank from the river Styx and forgot everything. Well, early on, when the Greeks started converting to Christianity, there was the story that Christ actually went in and brought all the shades out of there, and that almost clearly reflects the idea of how Greeks did not like that idea of afterlife, and much better like the idea of Christian afterlife, where you have at least hell or heaven, but you have some sort of self, some sort of identity after you're dead. But yeah, so this, in that sense, that's very similar. I'm going to stop because I've been talking forever and see if anybody else has anything else to say.
It's interesting to see when new religions come in and how sometimes elements can blend together. It's like Sikhism is a mixture of Islam and Hinduism, so they sort of blended as they rushed against each other.
Absolutely, absolutely. And another interesting thing is the way that these epic stories in some way reflect reality. For example, Satana and Soslan may be reminiscents of actual historical characters. There was an Alanic princess, and there was actually Georgian, a man who married the Georgian queen, Soslan. And that name, for example, is believed to be Turkic in origin, to where Batraz, on the one hand, he may be sort of an echo of an ancient god of celestial power, not battle, celestial power. But there's some indications that maybe there's some Turkic and Mongolian overlaps to that. Now, guys, we are getting pretty much close to being out of time, and I still have a ton of material. I don't know if this material is interesting to you guys, just rather just end this and move on to something else next time before we proceed.
It's
actually quite interesting, especially with the religious aspects of it, which of course interests me.
Right. So another character.
Let's continue.
Huh?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
So another character is Sirdon. And guys, I want to show you some pictures because I got a bunch of pictures of these. And these are just general pictures. Come on, open. What did I just do? I just wanted, again, I wanted some images of these people. Some of these are, of course, illustrations to books and so forth. Hold on, let me pull them up. But I wanted you, again, just like with the dancing in the beginning of the story, I wanted you to kind of have an idea of what kind of peoples we're talking about. Of course, this is back to Soslan dying. There's a lot of talk about herds. There's a lot of talk about cattle. Wealth is measured very much in cattle, as it was in a lot of people back in those times. So I wanted you to see some pictures of this cattle, of these endless herds that they're talking about, cows and goats. I wanted you to see some pictures of the faces of the peoples, so that you could put in a face to these characters like Soslan, like Uruzmag, these are warriors. Some of them are herders. Some of them are wise men. Some of them are dancing. Some of them are rejoicing. So that you get a little bit of an idea of an ethnic clothing, for example. You have a little bit an idea of what, of course, this is a much later edition. This is something as the result of the Caucasian Wars, the first Caucasian Wars back in the 18th, 19th century. These people of the mountains, these are people of beauty, who very much valued class, that very much valued style. People, as any warrior society, your appearance, of course, was extremely important because a warrior always has to look good. This is images of the wise men and the young warriors. You can see that they are portrayed in scale, and that's probably Ossetian, because Ossetians, with their Alanic stories, of course, they had the scales. We know that Alans were probably prototyped to later on medieval knights. This is some of the images of the warriors, again, riding away. These are some historical illustrations to costumes before there were any bullets in them, to some of the books, some historical photographs of these peoples. But anyway, so this would be a village, and each one of these towers would belong to a single household, to a single family, to where you have these various storage facilities right here. But you can see how they're located on the hills, and each one of these was defensible. Sometimes they would be connected by a bridge, either a hanging bridge, but at the bottom they would have a place where they would keep their animals. Then they would have
it's a little bit like the Scottish Broch.
Yeah. This is a different settlement. This is just an old village right there in the mountains. A similar settlement, more close up, but this idea of building towers, of dwelling in stone towers, was another one. Again, different styles, different peoples, But again, this kind of tower, like that's an old settlement plus a new settlement right there, and just a person. I mean, of course, the horse is very, very crucial to these people. Now, I promised to talk about the horses. The horses in these stories are usually magical, more towers. The horses in these stories almost always can talk. Almost always they're the hero's best friend. And I think that's the Hellenic Scythian element. I know that in Russian and some other Slavic folklore tales that have the horse extensively, the talking horse who is wiser than the character, who is more magical than the character, who is able to advise the character of where to go and how to solve a certain problem, a helper and a guide is very, very crucial to these tales. Again, you see these towers, these are just absolutely stunning views, right? Okay, so Jigit. Jigit is a word for Caucasian or writer, for Caucasian warrior, always important. These are just different people. Some of them are settings. I think these are Dagestani, might be settings, might be Georgian. Mountains are always very essential. These hats that are very warm, that are made out of, that's not hair, obviously, that's a hat that's made out of fur. That's an idea of what the warriors might have looked like. I'm sorry, it's not larger. I mean, so these are not primitive peoples, even though some of these stories, they harken back to beginning of time, majority of them. Here's an illustration of the basically Caucasian peoples at the time of the first Caucasian war. And I'm not talking about last century. I'm talking about beautiful dresses. And of course, every nation has their own style.
I was going to say, I really enjoy a lot of the stories and the dancing and whatnot, because it seems to stand up really well today in how we come up with new stories, basically inspired by these older ones of these people.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
And I would say, I would add to Ryan's comment, it's there's this like contemporary feeling of need to create the Marvel universe, and yet it was already people are already living it, thousands of years ago.
Right.
It almost makes me wonder if that was part of that. Of course, Greeks are an fairly early offshoot of Indo-Europeans. So,
oh yeah, you just think of the spread of the farming culture, like going from hunter-gatherers into farming, which started sort of in the Caucasus and moved into Europe. Started in Mesopotamia and other places, but a lot would have carried the stories with them.
Right. And to me, it seems like it was a repository almost of these stories. So as different tribes and peoples traveled through the region, they picked up what was already there and kind of left what was theirs. Okay, guys, I'm going to share these maps. Now, I don't have a good map about Adygea, but I'm going to share what I have, just kind of give you a kind of a rough idea of what region we're talking about as we're talking about it. So Adygi would be the peoples somewhere in this general area. And so Adygea stories, each different population. Now, we've been mainly talking about the Ossetian. This is the Ossetian people right here. That's the Ossetian mythos. That's the Ossetian people, we've been mainly talking about it. And there seems to be the most Hellenic, the most Scythian in nature. It has a lot of things in it. Their stories have a lot of subjects that are not in other epic stories. For example, the idea of paying a bride price and the abduction of the bride. The idea of, they talk a lot about the sea a lot, which is not really as essential to some of the other peoples. And considering where the Ossetians are currently located, they're not exactly near the sea, but they have memories. Even rivers such as Volga, for example, are mentioned in some of their stories. The topography, the locales, and some of the names and some of the customs, but again, back to the custom of having a cloak made out of human skins is something that seems to be much more Scythian. Now, the core of these epic stories and these core cycles, the one about Satana and her husband, the one about Soslan, he's called different things in different languages, but they all sound Susuruk, Sirdon, which we're going to talk about next time, he's the trickster. There's central core stories that there in all of these people's stories, but they differ slightly. So, for example, the Adygean stories, they talk a lot about agriculture. They talk a lot about plowing. They talk about sheep. They talk about goats. They talk about cows, of course, horses, bison, buffaloes. All these stories talk about metallurgy. They seem to have anything from early advent of metallurgy to where they're talking about bronze. One of the interesting things that's mentioned in almost all of these stories is the fact that sometimes when a hero gets a hole in his head as a result of being hit with a heavy, sharp object, the gods oftentimes will make bronze, basically a patch for his skull to repair it. I mean, if they thought about it, I wonder if they had tried it. I've never heard of an archaeological find with that kind of a correction. But I know today they use, of course, titanium plates, but who knows? There's always a smith god character in the core of these epic stories. And at the game, for example, there's even two of them. There's an older and a younger one. They're armed with a arrow, with bow and arrow. They're armed with swords. They have sticks that they beat each other up with different. They have double pronged spears, shields, of course. They talk about these defensive structures like I was showing you earlier. Now, if we go to Abkhazian stories, I'm going to back up. There's Abkhazians and Adigian stories are very, very close, but Abkhazian stories are slightly different because their story, and by the way, in all the other epic stories, the relations of the main characters they are basically patrilineal, so they follow like whose son you are. In Abkhazian stories, it's matrilineal more so than patrilineal. And Shatana in their stories is a lot more prominent. She's a lot more central. She's a lot more three-dimensional. She's very central to all of these stories, with the exception of the Dagestani and the Chechen versions, for example. Their languages are oftentimes called the Vaynakh languages. So anyway, but she's very much more central. And while they talk about agriculture as well, their agriculture, for example, in Abkhazia, they're more about wine and less about beer. In Ossetian stories, the central alcoholic beverage is beer, and they talk a lot about the advent of beer, to where in Abkhazia it's more about advent of wine. And that makes sense because actually wine growing is very much very widespread in Abkhazia. In Abkhazia, there's also much more focus on female craft and various female arts and domestic things, so just skills of making fabrics and just feminine duties are much more centralized and much more important. As we get away from the center, as we get away from Georgia, like I said, in Georgia, Georgia itself is populated by a whole different peoples group, but there's some regions of Georgia that have smaller related linguistically nationalities. See Kartvelian right here that only lists one language, but that's not true. There's a lot more. There's some groups in the mountains regions of Georgia that do have vestiges of the stories and actual center. Now, Dagestani people, I want to get to the Chechen people first. So Chechen and Gush people, Nakhchi people, they also have the stories of Narts, but in their stories, Narts suddenly become to the Chechen people, the Narts are newcomers, they're strangers, and oftentimes they're not good people. It's still an epic cycle, but it's an epic cycle where the Narts are not such good people, and then they end. In all of these tales, the Narts, of course, wind up dying for different reasons. And some they wind up going to sleep for a long time and they will be reawakened when the time arrives. And other ones, they see that they're no longer wanted on this earth and they wind up drinking molten bronze and killing themselves that way in order to go out. Or they're chased into a crevice somewhere and they're going to die of hunger and they want to die as warriors. And so they wind up drinking the bronze to kill themselves. And in Chechen and stories, in the Nakhchi stories in particular, the Narts have refused to submit to the god, to Allah, and for that they're exterminated. It's interesting how these monotheistic motifs overlap these much more archaic subjects, to where there's parts of these epic stories that are clearly, they almost predate the advent of metal. There are times when you talk, I mean, Abkhazian is considered, it's not necessarily the first, but it's probably, it has the most archaic traces in it, to where some, and then you have the new layers, because there's some stories about how, for example, the Narts challenged God by shooting at him from a cannon. I mean, which is obviously a fairly modern event, fairly modern occurrence. Guys, I'm going to stop and see if anybody else has anything else to say. We have 15 minutes over, so I'm probably going to wrap up and reconvene next time and finish these up. I'm just going to see if anybody else has anything else to say. And then I'm going to show our newcomer. Shen, come here. Shen, oh, you're right here, Smalls. I just wanted to show our guest visitor here. To those who haven't seen him yet, this is Shen. He's very small. And he's very fussy. And he does not like it here. Okay, David has something to jump in with, and then we'll see if anybody else has something else to say.
I just wanted to point out that particularly in the Abkhazian stories, you're looking at elements that are at the very dawn of agriculture at latest. The references to female matrilineal systems, lots of little things in the differences in their stories, and the Scythians, which are basically right next door, are pretty instructional, I think. And I think the steppe stories were kind of overlaid over this tradition that had been here a long, long time. That's what it suggests to me anyway. I'm certainly no expert, but
I actually did have a little bit of a question while we wrap up. Now, we are still talking mostly about these people had oral traditions. They were still not writing a lot of stuff down until later. Is that correct?
Yeah, Ryan, can you guys hear me?
I can
Here's
hear
the
you.
thing.
Can you hear me?
This is a subject that I'm going to tread very lightly on, because traditionally, by old school science, it was believed that a lot of these people, with the exception of the Armenian and the Georgian populations, were not. They were oral traditions only. That is currently heavily challenged by some of these groups. Abkhazians also had their own writing, but for example, the Nakhchi people, the Wainakh people, the Chechen and Gush people, they did have a long going back tradition, at least that when they converted to Islam, of written histories. So they would not agree with that statement, and I don't know enough about the subject to argue either way. I just wanted to point that out so I don't offend anybody of those peoples. But yeah, basically these are oral tales. This is something your grandma is likely to tell. Well, let me put it this way. When it comes to Dagestani people, it will be something that your grandma is likely to tell you as a bedtime story, or, to where the Chechen people, it's something that is more. There would be traveling bards, there would be traveling skalds, there would be people who would, just like in Scandinavian, just like in Saxon tradition, just like in, I don't know, Serbian tradition, a Slavic tradition, Germanic tradition, you would have peoples who would wander around, who were much respected, peoples who would sing these tales. In some cases, they would, again, well, like I said last time, in some cases they would be poetic. Nowadays, we mostly have them in prose form. Most likely, originally, they were poetic to begin with. They were not that different from Homer's Iliad, in the sense that they would they would have a rhythm, they would have formulaic cyclical phrases. A lot, for example, in our Iliad, we have, the fast-running Achilles, we have the brilliant Hector. I'm paraphrasing here, to where they would use the same kind of very typical terms within the stories. And moreover, there's some indication they were able to catch some, right at the end of 19th century, they were able to write down some of the musical melodic accompaniments that went to these stories. And there's some indication that, for example, each character would even have like his own or her own melodic theme, his or her own melodic story. So these were more likely were performed. What I'm imagining this went down as one of these traveling, much respected, they were almost considered divinely gifted peoples would come to a village, they would come to a settlement, and they would start performing, and they would usually, as oftentimes the skalds would perform over a period of several days, right? And there would be feasting, and people would gather about, the men and the women, and they all knew these stories. Of course, they knew them from their childhood. And the more gifted the particular storyteller, the particular bard was, the better, the more beautifully he would accompany himself with music. And as he was accompanying himself with music, the men would start dancing to the music, and then the women would start singing to the music. And so this almost turned into an interactive live performance situation, with the bard being the kind of the conductor, the orchestrator of this whole ritual. But this would be something very joyful. This would be immersive interactive theater almost. But it wouldn't be theater in the sense that we go to theater, even immersive theater, and we go there just to experience entertainment. This was their life. These people, these heroes, were so much like what they knew. For example, when Shatana and her husband got into a fight, and the husband wanted to divorce her, and how she called the feast and she tricked him into basically not wanting to divorce her. Or the stories when such and such wife went back to her family for vacation, basically, right? And something happened in her village while she was gone. All these occurrences, the mythological, the magical, the impossible would be so intermixed with their life that people would feel like they were part of it. They lived this over and over. These names are still oftentimes given in Ossetia. It's not uncommon to meet a girl or a man all across, honestly, Caucasus. It's not that uncommon to meet a woman and a woman named. I mean, if you put in any of these names, I was searching earlier for, Batraz, and there's Batraz. There's 50 Batraz who currently, I don't know, national representatives. They're, janitors. They are teachers. They're academics. They are singers. I mean, these are images. These are archetypes that exist within those cultures. To this day, they are alive. They haven't gone anywhere, even to this day. Moreover, it seems to me like they infiltrated a lot of cultures that they came into contact with, and echoes of these archetypes are the archetypes we see in the Greek and the Roman, in the Slavic, and the Scandinavian, you name it, images. I hope that's making a little bit of sense.
That clarifies a lot, actually. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Good. Okay, does anybody else wants to say anything else? Because we're way over time. Okay, let me look at the calendar.
I just have a next. Are we continuing this conversation?
If you guys are willing to, because I would like to wrap it up. There's still a couple of stories that I would like to tell, a couple aspects that I would like to visit.
It would be very interesting to if you could speak a little bit, following up about their social structure and their, if you will, family structure, communal structure.
Current Caucasian peoples or the Nartic?
The Nartic.
Yeah. Okay. Absolutely. I would love to do that. Yeah. That's something we definitely need to talk about.
Because I just sense so many similarities, casting, moving forward through history. Right.
Right. And the very I don't want to call it archaic. I don't want to call it tribal. It's root society. Right. Is what modern civilization has wiped off and erased, but what still exists in certain groups around the world, that family structure, that respect for the elders, the role of the husband, the role of the wife, and the fact that the community is so central to the survival of each individual, and each individual cannot exist. You can see in the Nartic epic stories, and we'll talk about that next time too, how that very essential communal existence suddenly got overlapped by more kind of where you have rich and the poor, and then you got overlapped by more modern ideas where the man suddenly becomes dominant over the woman, those kind of things. But the essence is always the same. It doesn't matter if you're looking at Native Americans, if you're looking at people in Africa, you're looking at people, I don't know, in Papua New Guinea, you're looking at people in the Caucasus, those traditional societies, those very root societies, they always fall into a certain pattern. I think there's a good reason for that. That's what people survive as if they don't have civilization.
Yeah, and to identify the difference between a raven and a crow.
Yep. Right. Yep. Thank you, everyone. It's so good to see you. That exist within every man's soul, and we will live forever, or as long as stories are